Okay. Well, thank you everyone for joining us tonight for the last event of the year for the Nashville Jewish Book Series. I'm so excited to introduce you to the moderator and author for this evening, but if for some reason you need closed captioning, the closed caption button is located on the bottom right. And you can select subtitles for that. We'll be having a Q&A at the end of the conversation. So if you have a question, please go ahead and put it in the chat and we will answer that when we get to the Q&A section. And as you know, this program is being recorded and I am happy to share the link as well if you want to reach out to me. So we're so excited tonight to partner with API Middle Tennessee and also The Porch to discuss Weina Randel's new book, The Last Rose of Shanghai, which falls perfectly in place as May is both Jewish American Heritage Month and also Asian American and Pacific Islander Heritage Month. So what better way to celebrate than discussing this really beautiful novel, which blends both Jewish and Asian history and culture together, and of course, love and music. If you're interested in purchasing the book, I will go ahead and put the link in the chat so that you can purchase it through bookshop.org. And I will also be putting a link in the chat for a workshop that Yurina, our moderator, will be leading on May 23rd at the Porch about writing multifaceted stories. So more information on that at the end of tonight's discussion. Our moderator for the evening is local writer and creative writing instructor, Yurina Yoshikawa. Yurina holds an MFA from Columbia University and teaches fiction and nonfiction writing at the Porch Writers Collective. Her writing has appeared in The Atlantic, NPR, Lit Hub, the Japan Times, and elsewhere. She was the winner of the 2020 Tennessee True Stories Contest and a 2021 recipient of the Tennessee Arts Commission. She has lived in Tokyo, Palo Alto, and New York before settling down here in Nashville, where she lives with her husband and two sons. Weina Randel is the award-winning author of 3 novels, The Last Rose of Shanghai, The Moon in the Palace, and The Empress of Bright Moon, a historical duology about, am I pronouncing this right? Wu Zetian?
Yeah.
Born and raised in China, Weina came to the United States at 24 when she began to speak, write, and dream in English. So without further ado, Yurina and Weina, let's take it from here.
Thank you, Sharon, and thank you, everybody. Yeah, this is going to be such a fun night. And I think what we'll do, especially for those in the virtual space who might still be working through their copy of The Last Rose of Shanghai, or perhaps you are just about to buy it on bookshop.org. Perhaps, Weina, would you be willing to read a little bit just to familiarize the audience with the book and your prose?
Okay, sure, of course. It will be my pleasure. So the book, if you have read it, you know it's told from 2 perspectives, Aiyi and Ernest. The book starts with Aiyi in a hotel, and then the first scene in 1940 is like how she met Ernest. I'm going to read the chapter from Ernest when right after they met, okay? So here, it's on page 10. He had never seen a Chinese girl in Berlin. The one today had been fascinating, a creature of beauty. Can you hear me?
Yes,
Okay.
sorry, that was...
All right. She had an oval face, flawless pale skin, expressive black eyes, a small nose, and red lips. Her hair was short, reaching her shoulders, her bands evenly trimmed and meticulously curled, framing her face. She seemed about his age, but her mannerisms were sophisticated, distant, with a strong sense of aloofness. He hoped, with all his heart that he would see her again. Suddenly feeling exhilarated, Ernest looked around. He was standing in front of a five-story building in smooth Art Deco design near a classical building graced with a statue of a Greek god and a neoclassical edifice crowned with a dome. And Sassoon's towering hotel with a green pyramid was a few feet away. It seemed in his escape he had circled back to the bustling waterfront again. He began to walk, searching, peering at the French, Danish, Italian, and English inscriptions on the buildings. They were international banks, American liquor trading companies, British tobacco groups, and Danish telegraph firms. Several companies hung the Star of David on the wall. He smiled, remembering that people on the ocean liner said that Jews had arrived in Shanghai to make a fortune as early as in 1843, after Britain defeated the Chinese Qing dynasty during the First Opium War. When the Bolshevik Revolution broke out in Russia, many Russian Jews, fearing persecution, had fled to Shanghai as well. The fact that his fellow men had found successes in Shanghai gave him great confidence. Surely he could make a living here. Admittedly, there were obstacles. He couldn't understand the language, didn't know anyone in Shanghai, and had no expertise in banking, engineering, baking, or trade. He loved photography and piano, but photography was a hobby, and he had given up on piano a few years ago. But he was 19, and he was willing to do anything to survive. He decided to try his luck at a barber shop behind the building with the Greek god. It had Russian words on the door and a faded poster of Rosh Hashanah on the window. His people, after all. He walked in. The shop had 5 empty chairs, and a middle-aged barber with a mustache holding a broom like an axe frowned at him. Before Ernest could ask, the barber shouted, "Get out of my shop!" Stunned, Ernest backed out, a faint murmur chasing him. Refugees, rats. He had been called many things. This was new. He shrugged and continued his search down the street. He walked into one shop after another, offering his services as a clerk to the Russian hardware store owner, a howling jockey to a French businessman in a leather and fur shop, then a dishwasher, a gear polisher, a fish fryer, or anything. No one would hire him. He left the stores, his head hanging low. He had been driven out of his home for being a Jew. Now, after crossing the oceans to an alien land, he was driven out again for being a refugee. So this is from Ernest. Now I'm going to read the part from Aiyi, which is like in the middle or later than middle on page 306. Two days later, I married Chen. It was the 18th day of January. Life was strange. Since childhood, I was told I would marry Chen. We had fought, played with crickets in the courtyard, and taken English lessons from our tutor while our parents chatted and drank jasmine tea in the family room. We were the Qingmei Zhuma, blue plum and bamboo horse, loving friends from childhood and a destined couple to be. Mother had told me repeatedly of my wedding day since I was little. It would be beautiful and beautifully fitting for a woman of my birth, a jade leaf growing on a gold branch. I would put on white powder and bright red lipstick to accentuate my beauty. I would step out of my room, my hair elaborately adorned by 1,000 jewels, my neck decorated with at least 3 thick gold necklaces. A traditional red silk veil would drape over my head, and my fingers, glowing with 12 gold rings, would lift the hem of a long dress for an easy walk. With each step, the bells, beads, and tassels on the veil would clink and peal, a melody of happiness and fortune. Someone, likely my maid, would give me a hand to guide me down the pebble path to the central room, the courtyard, and then the fountain near the gate where a red pelican would await with 4 lifters whom mother had hired. As I came close, the musicians would play the lute, cymbals, drums, and a French horn, and the fireworks would crack loudly. The throngs of family and relatives, all clad in festive red, would clap their hands, and the gate of my home would swing open, the red lanterns bouncing, and a Chen would take my hand. But in reality, I was too poor to wear jewelry. I was not beautiful either. My face was swollen, my lips pale, and my waist was soft like a fish belly. None of the dresses fitted me, so in an old gray tunic, I made my way out of the house without furniture to the empty courtyard without servants. I looked like a woman on the way to buy fish on the market. Holding a red silk veil, I started to cross the courtyard. It was quiet there, the ground still wet from yesterday's rain, no sight of musicians, or fireworks, or palanquins, or Singmei or relatives. Aiyi and her children were still sleeping. Near the fountain was Chen's buick. I stumbled, short of breath, nervous, but I shouldn't be. Chen would be a good husband. We would have as many children as his mother wanted, and we would live in his vast mansion with horses, birds, and gardens. I could play mahjong, rise up late in the afternoon, and scold the servants whenever I was bored. I put the red veil over my head. The world changed. The air wavered like a red screen, and the puddle near my feet roiled like Sassoon's cocktail. Yet my breath caught in my throat, and my heart thudded. Beyond the fringe of the redness, beyond the fountain, beyond the stone lions, stood Ernest, dressed in a traditional red Chinese wedding tunic, a large red bow across his chest. His curly hair was shaped like a precious crown, his smile glistening like sweet honey, his eyes shining like a promise. No more. I took Chen's hand. Ooh, okay.
Wow. Thank you so much for reading and sharing those excerpts. I read this book twice to prepare for this, but also out of enjoyment, and hearing you read out loud, that was a special experience. You have such a wonderful reading voice, first of all, but just the prose. The things that I noticed as a writer and instructor myself is just your attention to detail and just the way you make the scene come alive with sometimes with just a few words, but it's just so well done. And thank you for choosing those excerpts, because those are some of my favorites as well. I was thinking maybe in thinking about the first excerpt that you read with Ernest when he first comes to Shanghai. And for those who may not have caught this in hearing the excerpts being read, I wanted to point out that this novel is really interesting because Aiyi's parts are all written in the first person I, and Ernest's is a third person, but it follows him very closely. The narrator still is able to get in and out of his head and even his body. Like, you feel like you're really experiencing the world through his lens, but Ernest's parts are still written in the third person. So I was just wondering if you could talk a little bit about your decision making as a writer. Why did you decide to split the perspectives in this way?
Okay, well, all right. That's very important. And yeah, wonderful question, by the way, Yurina. I can tell you're a writer. Yeah, it was the choice was really intentional. First of all, I decided to write Aiyi in first person because Aiyi's voice came to me the moment I started this project. She just jumped out on me, and then I could really see where she was and how she would live in Shanghai in that kind of time. And I imagined her voice, this spoiled person, pampered, selfish, and growing up all got whatever she wanted. It was just that kind of character, and it was very explicit for me. So I somehow was able to put my head in her head immediately. So writing as her in first person was not a problem at all. But for Ernest, man, Ernest's voice was very hard for me to write, and he came to me very slowly and reluctantly. And maybe that's because he was a man. But anyway, it took me like 4 drafts and finally to understand him. But I felt like I wanted to give readers some kind of distance between him and the reader. And in that way, third person would probably work better. So that's why it was constructed that way. But another important reason is I wanted to show Shanghai, the city, the unique city, through 2 different perspectives. So with Aiyi, you would see the Chinese tradition, you would read about how Shanghai was like and how Shanghai was defined by the class and wealth, which was very much China was and is still. So I wanted to show that aspect. I also wanted to show Shanghai as a refuge for people who are foreigners, and when they arrived in Shanghai, how would they perceive this city? So you would have separate views from Shanghai through a native person and Shanghai through an outsider. And I wanted to keep them separate because I feel like in today's fiction, you would have uh, books written just focus on China only, and or you read novels written by Americans and from Americans' POV only. You don't get this perspective from the local and the foreigner that much. So for me, I wanted to give them equal weight of this narrative from a local person and the narrative who is an outsider of the culture. So I just did that deliberately. So you will have this shift of his and hers, hers and hers and his, like that for the whole novel.
Wow, that is just so interesting. And I think with Ernest's parts that are in third person, you really, I think, like you're saying, it's clear to me now after you said that we're getting his perspective, but also it's, we get this view of Shanghai that is perhaps less tinged with like nostalgia in the way that Aiyi's Shanghai is. It's just everything is new, and it's also during wartime. This is a great segue into my next question that I had prepared, which was that, especially in that part where Ernest arrives and he's at first a little relieved to see the Star of David and to see like, oh, maybe like there's no anti-Semitism here. And yet he immediately is discriminated against simply because he's a refugee. Like the people who had arrived in Shanghai just a few years ago, they see him just as like a different class of refugee, these layers. And this is the kind of history that I had never learned about, about these different classes of refugees in Shanghai. Also just, I think your novel just does a beautiful, vivid job of really shedding light on this sliver of history. So yeah, my next question has to do with your research process and how how you came to learn about this very specific aspect of World War II history and the kinds of preparation you had to do. You know, I know you said it took you 4 drafts to get to Ernest, but what was
Yeah.
the kind of research that you did to really inhabit the mindset of a Jewish refugee at that time?
So first about this part of history, I know we have lots of novels set in Europe and describe the atrocities against the Jews in Europe, and the history of Jewish survival in China especially is not very well known. For me, actually, it was kind of personal because I went to Shanghai for school and I worked there and I lived there for about 5 years. My college was located in Hongkou district, and every day I would pass a two-story red brick building with inscription says Moses Church in Chinese. But we know it's actually not a church, it's a synagogue. But in Chinese, church and synagogue were the same words. So Chinese really did not know the difference. And while I was in Shanghai at school, I heard many people were talking about Jews in Shanghai, like how many European Jews fled to Shanghai and found a refuge in the city. And they would say, like, the Chinese were very curious about Jews, and they would invite those refugees into the homes and have teas and dumplings with soy sauce. So that was before 1940 then. Um, they were also saying after 1940, after Pearl Harbor, then the Japanese confined all the Jews. The Japanese declared a war with the U.S. and then they also attacked Shanghai on the same day, and Shanghai fell, and the Japanese grouped arrested the foreigners and sent them to 5 internment camps in Shanghai. And they also arrested the Jews, the European Jews who arrived in China, in Shanghai after 1938 in a ghetto in Hongkou district. So while those Jews were confined in the ghetto, they were not able to receive food or anything because nobody was able to help them. All the wealthy Americans were sent to the internment camps. So the locals, they heard the story and they were very sympathetic of those Jews. And whenever they could, they would throw the loaves of bread and rice balls as well into the alleys to feed the Jews. So I heard that when I was in college, and I just remember the story, but I never thought to write it because I was in college, I couldn't write that. And the story, though, stayed with me after I immigrated to the US and I married my husband. He's Jewish. And I made many Jewish friends, and one of the friends was also a bookworm, and after I published my 2 novels, and she said, "When I love your books, you got to write books about Jews in Shanghai. You know about Jews and you know about Shanghai, and this will be perfect story for you to do." So I came back home and I started to do research, and I found out all the internment camps, the refugees. Just light bulb just came off. I was like, yeah, I can do this. There's a story there. It has to be a love story, so I can write about Chinese culture. I can also write about Jewish traditions, which I'm very familiar with. So that's how the idea came from. But however, though, like I said earlier about Ernest, the character was very difficult to write because he was a Jewish refugee. I understand my husband's Jewish mind, but I don't understand the refugee's mindset. So I had to read a lot of memoirs written by the survivors. And one book I read was Shanghai Refuge by Ernest Hepner. And I read the book so many times. I was so inspired. I learned so much from the book. So I named my main character after the author, Ernest Hepner.
I
That's
love that.
great.
It's just I love the mix of the, the fact that the story was always imprinted in your brain from your college days, and
Mhm.
then later it all came together also on a personal level because now you're part of a Jewish family yourself, and um, it's yeah, and the origin story of naming him Ernest, that's really sweet too. Um, I was wondering, yeah, it was while you were doing this research and reading a lot, and writing through these scenes, was there anything that surprised you, about, was there anything that you had maybe, not known from your college days in Shanghai that you discovered because of writing this book?
Yeah, there were many details. For instance, while I was in Shanghai, I had no idea that Jews actually lived basically right next door in the alley. And during my research, I realized it was very rare for Jewish people to interact with the locals. Very, very rare. So when I was writing that story, I was like, it's impossible two people from two different cultures would actually come together and fall in love based on their research. Because the European Jews, they couldn't speak Chinese. Only a few of them were able to speak English. And the Chinese people, they couldn't speak English. They were only speaking the Shanghai dialect. The barrier was enormous. It was very difficult to put them actually together. So I had to find the common ground. What was the the one ingredient will bring these two people together? And that was music.
Yes, yes. I'm so glad you brought that up. I had a question about that, and before our recording started, we had kind of talked a little bit about how
Mhm.
Nashville is dubbed
Yeah,
Music City. We
yeah.
have a very strong history with all kinds of music, not just country, but bluegrass, pop, rock, jazz. And yeah, Shanghai jazz, as you describe in this book, is seems like a very particular genre.
Yeah.
And, I think the fact that these two unlikely heroes of this book, that they would find each other and fall in love. I love that the way they connect as music, and that makes complete sense to me because music is one of those universal languages. And specifically with Shanghai jazz, I'm wondering, if we could talk about your connection with this type of music, and even tying it into, the title of the book, The Last Rose of
Okay.
Shanghai, which is also the title of the piece that Ernest on the piano plays, um, for Aiyi, because it's her favorite song. So I was wondering if we could talk a little bit about, yeah, Shanghai jazz, and also how you came up with the title of the song.
Okay, so yeah, I'm happy to talk about that. First of all, I have to tell you, you probably a very good musician, but I'm not a musician. I have terrible musical taste, and I can't play any instruments. I'm basically not a musical person. I don't have any musical cells, by the way. This is my
That is a
confession.
surprise to me because you write music, you write about music so well. I had assumed that you had a lot of musical background.
Well, thank you. But so the story goes, when I was trying to create Ernest, I had to make them have this connection. So it seemed, excuse me. So I decided he has to be the pianist because at that time my son was taking piano lesson
Oh,
from this tutor like for 5 years. And for 5 years, every Tuesday at 3 o'clock, I took him to the studio and I sat there in the room as he was taking lesson. So I heard everything about music, all those techniques. I just can't play it. So my piano piano education started over there. So when I was writing about Ernest, I was like, yeah, I can do that. I can use the knowledge I've learned and write about that as a pianist. And also, when about Shanghai jazz. That was something I discovered during research, because during the research I learned after the Great Depression, many American musicians, especially African American musicians, they couldn't find a job in Chicago or New York City. So they traveled all the way to Shanghai to make a living. And some of the musicians collaborated with the local Shanghai musicians in the bars and nightclubs. So even after they left, the music stayed in Shanghai. And then the local musicians blend the American jazz into Chinese folk song and created this new genre called Shanghai jazz. It's very similar, like swing, swing, swing. It's for Ernest, who was used to play classical music, it was like no-brainer. He could pick up quickly. And I did this test with my son's piano teacher. I was like, "Can you play this? You're classically trained. Can you do this?" And he was like, "Oh yeah, of course. Very easy." So I tested
Wow.
on my son's piano teacher. And music, though, even though I can't play any instruments, but I feel music has this power that can overwhelms you. And many people, even if we don't speak the same language, even if we come from different background, we hear music, we just feel the same passion in our heart. So I felt this was very important to feature in the Last Rose of Shanghai. And as I wanted to bring people together, even though we have different cultures, um, also in the novel, you can see the music is not just one thing that bring them together. It's like a glue that hold these two people together, and the role of music changes as the plot moves. It's actually a very important role by itself. At the beginning, they meet because of music, and then in certain parts, Aiyi was able to go through many difficult stages of her life because of the music. But then the concept of music changed for Ernest as well, because when he was in Berlin, he was banned from playing the piano in the music hall because he was Jew. But then in Shanghai, he rose because of his music talent, and then of course later changes as well. So it's interesting to discuss music. I love to talk about this. But the title, though, it's originally when I thought about this novel, when I was writing, I thought this is a love story, so it makes sense if you call this The Rose of Shanghai. But then, because of all this atrocity and the crimes against all Chinese people and Jews in the book, I wanted to deliver this message about the war, the stupidity of the war, and this should never happen again. So I call this The Last Rose of Shanghai. And I made up the lyrics. If you Google it, you will not be able to find the lyrics because use music lyrics in a novel. The cost is huge. It's impossible to get the copyrights. So I was like, I'll just write it myself. It was easier.
Well, you made it sound like a real song. I did Google it later and I couldn't find it. But I did Google, I found on YouTube examples of Shanghai jazz. And that was I loved listening to that while reading, just to kind of have it in the background. And I thought, what a beautiful answer. And I think something that a lot of us in the room who live in Nashville, who, a lot of people who live here are connected with music in one way or another, I think. And so that was really beautifully put. Thank you for talking about that.
Oh, thank you.
Pivoting a little bit, I have another question that I think might be of interest. And it has to do with this is a historical novel that's based on real events and also infused with some fictional characters. There are a few key supporting characters here that are based on prominent historical figures of this time in Shanghai. And among them are the businessman and hotelier Victor Sassoon, journalist Emily Han, and the poet Shao Sen-mei. And I was wondering, as a writer, how did you balance the research aspect of it, trying to get it accurate and right, and also fictionalizing the parts that can't come out through research, like, you like we saw earlier, you have such great attention to detail with the sensory smells, or just like gestures, or just the way they are as humans. Like, how did you balance the research and coming up with these other things?
You are an instructor, and I'm pretty sure you have a lot of insights to share. I'm happy to sprinkle some of my tips here.
Yes, please.
So, writing fiction is very much, writing historical fiction is very much like writing sci-fi and fantasy in terms of world building. But for historical fiction, it's probably a little bit easier because it will ground you. It has some kind of frame, like historical events and historical figures that you have to follow in order to be identified, defined as a historical novel. For historical novel, especially when you're writing about the characters. So, okay, let me go back to that a little bit. For me, writing historical novel is essentially an editing process. You have to edit certain timelines, shift to certain timelines sometimes, and you have to fill in or redefine certain minor events as well in this character's personal space. And sometimes you will also have to edit this character's main trait, main character. But it's hard to do when you have this character is well known, because you will have to kind of follow this main historical figure's character. And if you don't follow it, you get it wrong. When you publish a novel, people are gonna write you angry emails, so you don't want that. But writing historical fiction, though, especially when you writing about the historical figure, is still an editing process, because you got to highlight the main trait, and then you will have to trim off all those non-essential characteristics. For me, for instance, writing Sassoon in The Last Rose of Shanghai, you get this feeling that he's this British millionaire who's a womanizer. That comes from the research actually, yes, that comes from many resources. And when I was doing events, in-person events, I would usually single him out, and I would show readers the picture of Sassoon sitting on a couch surrounded by 3 beautiful actresses, young girls, and he was having the best time of his life. And then I would go down to the next slide, showing readers the giant building, the Sassoon house, the hotel. And then I would point out this penthouse, his penthouse, that was built in 1930. And in the penthouse, you would see he had this like entire 360 degrees view of the city. And the inside his bathroom, he had 2 baths in his bathroom. And at that time in 1930, to have 2 baths in a bathroom was very rare. So people would ask him, why would you have 2 baths in your bathroom? And his answer, and this comes from research, his answer was this: I like to share my bed, but I don't like to share my bathroom. So you got this sense, this is what you've done. You found out this character is like this, and how would you recreate this kind of character in the novel? I follow faithfully about this aspect of his life. He was a womanizer. He liked women. He liked women very much. And that was in the novel. But there were other traits of his life I did not add in. So yeah, this is kind of balance that you have to edit the characters a little bit.
Wow. Yeah. And for me, as the novel goes on, Sassoon really becomes this complex. I think all of them have complex sides to them. I felt a lot of like sorrow and just a lot of empathy. And for a character who maybe in the very beginning I would have never expected to feel so much for. So yeah, I think you do a really great job of leaving these characters who at first might seem like they are who they are kind of on the outside, but
Yeah.
the way you write through them, we get a really great sense of who they are, maybe behind closed doors, or when they're not having to perform in front of the public, as Sassoon probably had to really put on a face for his clients and
Oh yeah.
whatnot. And
Yes.
but when he in private, he came across as a very different person. And yeah, that's that balance, I think. Yeah, it's really fascinating. And I like what you said about world building. I never really thought of historical fiction as something that can be compared with, science fiction or fantasy, but that also makes sense to me. And I think I have one other question for you before I open it up to this room for audience questions. And,
Okay.
not to give everything away, but throughout this sweeping, beautifully written novel, I just, there's just so many losses and tragedies. It's a very, my heart broke multiple times throughout this book. And I just wondered, as a writer, if you ever found it difficult to write out some of these very hard scenes, or if there was ever a sense of catharsis or relief that you got out of writing some of these.
Well, Yurina, I think you'll point out something very personal right here. Yeah, it is. I would say it's both. It's hard to write those scenes. Especially with the Last Rose of Shanghai, there were many heartbreaking moments, and all those moments have to be rendered through words. It really takes a lot out of a writer to just pour everything out. And on the other hand, I wrote the novel right after my mom passed away, and it was very sudden. I talked to her on Sunday, and then on Thursday she was gone. So it was a lot for me to process, and it's been 5 years. I still don't think I've got over that. But writing those those moments helped me to express myself a little bit. For instance, like when Ernest had to go through a very difficult time, his expression was, grief was like a dough. You press it down, it still rolls up. And for Aiyi, her expression was, a family without mother is like a pearl necklace without a string. And that actually came from my own personal experience as well. But I don't think we can ever say we will get over grief, especially if something very endearing. You think you do, you think you're better, you think you have expressed everything in your writing. But a few months later, a few days later, it hits you again. So I don't know if I answered your question.
No, thank you so much for sharing that, and what a powerful answer. And, yeah, I think that really, really came across reading your work. And for me personally, having gone through, very close, like a grief for a very close family member myself, some of the scenes were difficult to read, but also I found it healing for me to read through as well. So I had that kind of inverse experience. And yeah, I just really want to thank you for all the work you put into this, and for how lucky we are that we get to have this out in the world and discuss it. And I'm really excited, not to just immediately like plug thing that I'm supposed to plug, but I'm teaching a course in a couple weeks based on your book. So we'll study a couple excerpts, perhaps even the ones that you had read and mentioned, and we'll do writing exercises. And I'd love to definitely incorporate some of your answers from tonight in
It's
what I
wonderful.
discussed. So
I'm so honored. Thank you so much, Yurina. You asked excellent questions, very insightful, and thank you for the opportunity.
thank you, Weina. That means a lot. You're such a wonderful writer to talk to. And yeah, for the sake of time as well, I'd like to open it up. And perhaps since we started a bit late, we can also go a few minutes past 8, if that's okay. And
Yep.
just want to make sure that we, get through questions. So if anybody in the audience here has a question, I think if you're able to unmute yourself and speak. But if you wanted to type out your question in the chat, I'm happy to read them out loud on your behalf as well. So let's open it up to the room.
Oops.
Oh, I think there was one question in the chat. Do you have a follow-up book to the story?
Oh, follow up to the story. The Last Rose of Shanghai actually is a standalone, but my next book actually, which it just came out a few months ago, called Night Angels. And it tells you why or how those Jews received visas and were able to flee to Shanghai.
Wow.
It's based on a true story and based on historical figure called Dr. Hofenshan. He was the Chinese diplomat who issued thousands of visas to Jews so they could flee to Shanghai.
I think that would definitely be of interest to everybody here. Any other questions? What about what you are working on next? You said you already wrote this other book, but do you have another project that you're currently working on?
I always write, Yurina. You know, as a writer, you can't stop writing. Even though sometimes it doesn't make sense, you still write, right? I actually have going to have an announcement very soon. I will have to keep it as a secret for now.
What's the best way to is there the best way to find out about that announcement?
Probably Publishers Market or my social media. I would definitely announce it when my agent publishes that. I would do that.
That's
Let's
very
connect
exciting.
on social media.
Question. I was wondering your descriptions of the war, everything about the war and the people being affected and all. I really felt like I was in it. Have you ever been in or around war, or it was just from what?
Fortunately, I didn't. I think it has to, for writer, it's important to create a scene. And in this scene, readers will be brought to the scene, and the key is to make you guys keep reading and be immersed in the story. And so what I did was use 5 senses to make you feel the character was there. I was not in Shanghai in 1940s. I'm in my 40s right now. I was born in 1980s, so I wasn't there. Fortunately, I didn't go to any real war zone either, so I imagined everything. I'm happy that you like it, though. Thank you.
We have another question in the chat. It says, how do you create some distance between your work, which can delve into difficult issues, and your everyday life?
Oh man, that's such a great question. How it is actually very hard. Sometimes I got sucked in the story, and And I was just writing, and my husband came by and like, "Are you okay?" I was like, "Yeah, what's wrong?" He's like, "You're crying." Oh man. So yeah, that's something that happens quite often. And my family is very important for me because they keep me grounded and they need me to go grocery shopping and vacuum the floor. Those are very important chores that can take me back to reality. And I'm very grateful for that. And
Any
by the
other
way,
questions? Oh yeah.
being a writer is it's very hard to be friends with a writer because of uh, the way our mind works. Because I'm always in another world, and sometimes when you talk to me, I appear to be listening, but I might not respond. It creates tension between friendship because you would think, well, how come you are not even paying attention? But the reality is, for a writer, I'm always thinking about the scene, the story, and sometimes even if I don't want to, I get just slipped into it. Wouldn't even know. So it's harder to make friends with writers. But writers know each other, right?
Yeah, no, that's a really interesting point. I think I read somewhere, maybe in another interview you gave, that you allot time for socialization
Mm.
and that you separate, like to separate your writing life from the time you spend chatting and catching up with friends.
Yeah, well, I admire people who can separate all this kind of space. But it is very common for me. I'm writing now and I'm going to keep writing for 6 months. I would not even know who the president is, which year it is. 6 months later, hi, how's everything going? Then so let's catch up. It's very
Does anybody else have questions for Weina?
Well, we spoke prior about how a few of us really did not know much history about, excuse me, the Jewish history in Shanghai. And I guess I'm just curious in terms of how widespread it is about the history of Jews in Shanghai, like in China as a whole, since China is very big as well. How is it talked about there? Is it in like history books in China?
Yeah, that's a great question. So last year I was in an event in Cherry Hill, New Jersey, and one gentleman was asking me. He said, "I went to Shanghai looking for the Jewish ghetto. I was able to find this Shanghai Holocaust Museum, but I could not find the Jewish ghetto or any signs of it. And I went around and asked the people in Shanghai. Nobody could tell me. And the gentleman asked me why they couldn't tell me. Is it because they don't want to talk about it? I said, I'm so sorry, but the fact is the Chinese people, most of them, they have no idea about the Jews in Shanghai or how long they stayed there and where they come from. They had no idea because right after World War II, China had the Civil War for 4 years. And after the Civil War, China had this Cultural Revolution lasted for 10 years. And the Chinese people themselves, they were suffering. And their history books were focusing on their own suffering, their politics. They did not know that much about Jews. And especially during World War II, Jews, the government was not today's government. That government was the nationalist, which was the government of Taiwan. And now the Chinese government, of course, is the Communist Party, ruled by the communists. So they did not like to get into the historical events while the nationalists were dominating. So this is a clear political explanation. But for many Jews who were looking for any signs of that family in Shanghai, they were very disappointed. They couldn't find anything that would be even suggestive of their life in Shanghai.
I have a follow-up question to that, if that's okay. I'm curious, is this book translated in other languages, including Chinese? Is it published there?
Oh, yeah, that's a great question, Yurina. So the book has been translated into 13 languages, including Russian, Hebrew, and Polish, and Italian, and Spanish, and Portuguese, but not in China, because
Oh,
a Chinese market, publishing market, is different. All the books, the foreign books, my books are considered foreign books because it's written in English. So it had to go through censorship. It had to go through the government's channels. And it's very difficult. And for the Chinese government, they have a limit of 12 books, 12 foreign books a year to be published in China.
wow.
But yeah, but anyway, we can still hope. I really wanted my
Yes.
family in China to read this story.
Hopefully, yeah, I did not know that about China's publishing laws. Does anybody else have any other questions before we wrap up?
Well, I want to remind everyone that about, excuse me, the writers workshop with Yurina on May 23rd from 6 to 8 p.m., where Yurina will moderate a discussion from an excerpt, excuse me, of The Last Rose of Shanghai, and guide students in a short writing exercises on the theme of multifaceted storytelling. This is designed for writers of all stages, and even if you have not read the book, you are able to join. So please refer to the link that I put in the chat earlier for that. It should be, excuse me, I'm sorry, I have something caught in my throat. It should be really beautiful.
Yeah, I'm really excited to teach that. And this evening has just been so informative, and I'm excited to dive right back in a few weeks. But Weina, thank you so much for your time, for talking with me and the group. And this will be posted on the, I believe the YouTube
we'll put
channel?
it on the YouTube channel. We will upload
Great.
it. So anyone who missed it will be able to access it as well. And yeah, and thank you so much for joining us. This was really special.
Thank you. I had a great discussion. Thank you so much for the excellent questions, Yurina, and thank you so much to Gordon JCC for inviting me to this event. I hope to see you guys soon, very soon.
I think Margaret wants to say something.
No, I just wanted to say thank you. Thank you to everyone.
right.
It's terrific.
Thank you.
Yes.
Thank you, everyone,
you,
for
And we
coming.
want to thank also our committee who has helped us throughout the year with all our programs. And we are so happy that everyone was able to join us for this last event.
Yeah, and thank you to Jewish Book Council. They
Yes.
have been very supportive of my books. I'm so grateful to them.
Thank you. I hope everyone has a good evening.
Bye.
Bye. Thank you.
Bye.